Hi, I'm Amy Goodman. Did you know you can get Democracy Now!'s headlines and stories delivered directly to your inbox every day? Just text Democracy Now!, one word, no space. Text Democracy Now! To 66866 to subscribe to our daily digest, and you'll never miss a story. Once again, Democracy Now!, one word, to 66866. Thanks so much, and stay safe. From New York, this is Democracy Now!
I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces.
President Biden's defending his decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan as calls grow for the United States and other nations to do more to help civilians trying to flee after the Taliban take control of Afghanistan. We'll speak with Afghan law professor Haroon Rahimi, investigative journalist Asmat Khan, and retired U.S. Army Colonel Ann Wright, who helped reopen the U.S. Embassy in Kabul nearly 20 years ago. Then we go to Haiti, where Tropical Storm Grace has slammed parts of the country hit by Saturday's earthquake, which has killed more than 1,400 people.
My house is completely destroyed. I have lost everything. I don't even have bed sheets. I have no food. I have nothing.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Biden's defending his decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan. He spoke from the White House Monday, one day after the Taliban captured the Afghan capital, Kabul.
The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision.
Human rights advocates are urging the United States and other nations around the world to open their doors to the thousands of refugees who are desperately trying to flee Afghanistan. Nobel Peace Prize winner Malala Yousafzai, who survived an assassination attempt by the Pakistani Taliban, spoke out Monday.
I think every country has a role and responsibility right now. Countries need to open their borders to Afghan refugees, to the displaced people. Biden has a lot to do. President Biden has to take a bold step for the protection of the people of Afghanistan.
Progressive U.S. lawmakers have also joined the call. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib tweeted, "If we don't start putting everyday people first, no matter what country they're born in, this will keep happening. Let's start by opening our country to shelter refugees fleeing the consequences of our actions," Tlaib said. Meanwhile, the U.S. government's reportedly planning to hold some 30,000 Afghan refugees at two military bases, Fort Bliss in Texas and Fort McCoy in Wisconsin. Fort Bliss is currently holding hundreds of unaccompanied migrant children and has been plagued by allegations of abuse and unsafe conditions. We'll have more on Afghanistan after headlines. Tropical Storm Grace swept into Haiti and the Dominican Republic overnight, bringing heavy rain and winds just 2 days after a massive earthquake killed more than 1,400 people in Haiti. Saturday's 7.2 magnitude quake left some 6,900 people injured, and the toll is expected to rise. Hospitals report they're inundated with earthquake survivors and facing a shortage of medical supplies. In the city of Lekai and the town of Jeremy, two of the most badly hit by the quake, roads were further damaged due to aftershocks and mudslides. In related news, Haitian and immigrant justice advocates are denouncing the Biden administration for its ongoing deportations of Haitian asylum seekers even after the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse in July. Last week, at least 2 deportation flights departed from Texas to Haiti with some 130 refugees, including children. In a statement, Guerline Joseph, co-founder of the Haitian Bridge Alliance, said, quote, "How can the U.S. government deport anyone to Haiti right now? How do they think so little of Haitian lives, deporting children and babies in the middle of the chaos? This is a clear example of external violence that continues to deepen the instability in Haiti," she said. The Biden administration will advise nearly all U.S. residents to get a booster shot against COVID-19 8 months after they completed their initial vaccinations. White House officials told reporters the plan's contingent on FDA approval, but could be formally announced as early as this week. Public health officials believe the shots could provide additional protection against Delta and other emerging coronavirus variants, but the policy is likely to deepen the global vaccine divide. Of the 4.7 billion vaccines distributed worldwide, more than 80% have gone to the richest countries. The World Health Organization's called for a moratorium on booster shots until at least 10% of people in every nation have been vaccinated. Meanwhile, outrage is growing after Johnson & Johnson shipped at least 32 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine produced in South Africa to the European Union, with plans to ship 10 million more, even as the African continent faces its deadliest wave of the pandemic. A clause in South Africa's contract with Johnson & Johnson requires South Africa to waive its right to impose export restrictions on domestically produced vaccines. Just a small fraction of Africans have been vaccinated against COVID-19. By comparison, nearly 2/3 of Germany's population has received at least 1 dose. The People's Vaccine Alliance said in response, quote, "This is further proof that the world cannot trust a handful of pharmaceutical companies to fairly allocate vaccines across the world." U.S. coronavirus cases continue to soar, with hospitalizations now at levels seen during last summer's peak. The U.S. is now detecting over 140,000 new infections a day, with Florida, Hawaii, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Oregon all recording their highest caseloads of the pandemic. In Arkansas, a record high number of patients are on ventilators, with more than 300 people intubated. Medical workers at a Little Rock hospital report they're overwhelmed.
It's actually really hard. I made it a whole year without crying, and then actually a couple of months ago left here from work crying because of so many two deaths in one shift from patients that I've had for very long periods of time.
Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser said Monday all healthcare workers in the district must be at least partially vaccinated against COVID-19 by the end of September. New York's outgoing Governor Andrew Cuomo announced a similar requirement. In Florida, nearly 5,600 students and more than 300 employees of Hillsborough County schools have either tested positive for COVID-19 or are currently in quarantine. Florida Republican Governor Ron DeSantis has prohibited schools and local governments from ordering mask mandates. In Tennessee, Republican Governor Bill Lee signed an executive order Monday allowing any parent or guardian to opt out of mask requirements in school. In Arizona, a judge in Maricopa County ruled Monday Republican Governor Doug Ducey's ban on mask mandates is not yet in effect. The ruling leaves the Phoenix School District's mask requirements in place until at least September 29th. Also on Monday, Governor Ducey ordered local governments not to create their own vaccine mandates. Indiana Governor Eric Holcomb Monday broke from his Republican counterpart, saying school districts requiring masks are, quote, making a wise decision when the facts warrant it. Malaysian Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin resigned Monday amid mounting public anger over his government's handling of the COVID-19 crisis. Malaysia is in the grip of its worst wave of the pandemic and is averaging more than 20,000 daily cases, with just 1/3 of Malaysians fully vaccinated. Iranian officials have ordered a 6-day countrywide lockdown to battle its worst surge of the pandemic. Iran reported a record COVID-19 death toll Monday with over 650 deaths. In Tehran, residents reported the lockdown was being only loosely enforced.
When there is a lockdown, many people continue to go to work. They come and go. It's called a lockdown, but everything is operating, and restaurants and businesses continue to do business.
In immigration news, the Biden administration has appealed a Texas federal judge's order to reinstate the contested Trump-era Remain in Mexico program. In his decision, Judge Matthew Kacsmaryk, a Trump appointee, ruled the Biden administration, quote, failed to consider several of the main benefits of the 2019 policy, formerly known as the Migrant Protection Protocols, or MPP. The program forced some 68,000 asylum seekers to wait in often extremely dangerous conditions in Mexico while their cases made their way through U.S. courts. Many reported kidnappings and facing brutal violence while waiting in Mexico. The Biden administration officially terminated the program in June. The United States government has, for the first time in history, officially declared a water shortage on the Colorado River, ordering mandatory cuts to water consumption across states in the Southwest. This comes as Lake Mead, which is fed by the Colorado River, has hit an unprecedented low level of just 32% amidst an unprecedented drought. This is Tanya Trujillo, Assistant Secretary of Water and Science at the U.S. Interior Department.
There's no doubt that climate change is real. We're experiencing it every day in the Colorado River Basin and in other basins in the West.
Northern Minnesota, where resistance to construction of the Enbridge Line 3 tar sands pipeline continues, 4 water protectors Monday locked themselves to each other and to machines, halting a pipeline work site near Hay Creek. Their protests followed similar direct actions last week.
This pipeline and all pipelines like it are violations of Indigenous rights and an assault on our collective future in a world of increasing climate crisis.
I am here to stand with Indigenous people in sovereignty to protect their land against big oil industries that are hell-bent on destroying the land, taking from the people, and making profits. Enbridge.
I'm doing this action in support of Indigenous resistance, in support of stopping Line 3, in support of the incredible Indigenous-led movement. I'm doing this for future generations. I'm doing this because I hope to raise a child one day in this world, and climate change is too urgent. We can't wait on politicians that failed us. We have to take action.
More than 700 water protectors protesting Line 3 have been arrested to date. If completed, the pipeline would carry more than 750,000 barrels of Canadian tar sands oil a day across Indigenous land and fragile ecosystems. Line 3 has the backing of the Biden administration. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Thousands of Afghans who work for the United States and other foreign countries remain stranded in Kabul 2 days after the Taliban seized control of Afghanistan. Military flights out of the Kabul International Airport have resumed a day after thousands of Afghans raced to the airport with hopes of leaving the country. They filled the tarmac and some even tried to grab on to departing planes. At least 7 people died, including several who fell to their deaths after trying to cling onto U.S. planes as they flew out. U.S. troops also shot at least 2 people dead at the airport. On Monday, President Biden defended his decision to withdraw troops from Afghanistan.
I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. That's why we're still there. We were clear-eyed about the risks. We planned for every contingency, but I always promised the American people that I will be straight with you. The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. If anything, The developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves.
On Monday, the Biden administration pledged to spend $500 million to help refugees and others trying to flee Afghanistan. But Biden is facing growing pressure to do more to help Afghan civilians. On Monday, Congressmember Ilhan Omar tweeted, "There will be plenty of time for confronting the repeated failures of Afghanistan policy over the course of 4 presidencies. The urgency of the moment now demands we marshal an international coalition to evacuate every Afghan citizen who's fleeing for their lives." Nobel Peace Prize winner Malala Yousafzai urged all countries to help Afghan refugees.
I think every country has a role and responsibility right now. Countries need to open their borders to Afghan refugees, to the displaced people. And I have sent a letter to Prime Minister Imran Khan asking him to allow refugees, but also ensure that the refugee children and girls have access to education, have access to safety and protection, that their futures are not lost, that they can enroll into local schools, they can receive education within those refugee camps. I have not yet made contact with Prime Minister Boris Johnson, but whoever can hear me right now, I think it's important for them to remember that they have such an important strategic leadership role to play right now, and they must take a bold stance for the protection of human rights right now.
Malala Yousafzai won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2014. After being shot in the face by the Taliban in Pakistan when she was 14 years old for advocating education for women and girls. Since seizing Afghanistan, the Taliban has sought to present a more moderate face to the world. Earlier today, they announced an amnesty to all government officials and urged them to return to work. The Taliban also encouraged women to join its government. And today, a female journalist from the news outlet Tolo News conducted a televised interview with a Taliban official. We begin today's show with Haroon Rahimi, assistant professor of law at the American University of Afghanistan. He was en route back to Kabul when the Taliban seized power. So he's joining us now from Istanbul, Turkey. Professor Rahimi, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us.
Thanks to be here. Thank you.
So can you respond to all that has taken place? The extremely fast seizing of the provincial capitals and then taking Kabul without hardly a bullet. Can you talk about the significance of the Taliban victory, who they are, and what you expect?
So obviously there's a lot to unpack there in terms of the general fact that the Taliban took over Afghanistan. It's important to have context here. The Taliban have been growing in strength, and the government was losing ground for a very long time. It did not start matters of months, and underlying those trends were a series of political problems that were sustaining the insurgency and weakening the government legitimacy, and many other aspects of governance were suffering. But were also a military component to it. There were technical, logistical, and military issues and bad leadership that affected contributed to the overall trend, and towards the end, they exacerbated even further and resulted in the quick collapse of Afghanistan into the Taliban hand. There was also a psychological component to all of this. The way that the Taliban were received by the United States, other countries, the way they were conducting their propaganda underground, they all played a role in the matter. And we just have to go. I mean, it's going to take years to unpack what happened and how it happened, but it's a very complex picture. And Just commenting on what President Biden said, I would just like to point out, because you were just playing his clip, just a few points before I go talk who the Taliban are and what it means now, where we are right now. First of all, he's, I think the decision to withdraw troops is a decision made by the U.S. president. I will not comment on that. But just there was some inaccuracy in what he said. First of all, the fact that Afghan soldiers were not willing to die for Afghanistan. Just don't have to take my word for it. Go look at the UNAMA, the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. They report the casualty reports of war. For a very long time, the U.S. had almost no casualty in Afghanistan, whereas there were thousands of soldiers dying every day fighting for the Republic, for the government side. So the idea that soldiers were not willing to fight is not just true. The soldiers did surrender en masse, especially towards the end. It was a complex dynamic. You can go into it. There was some political decisions made to keep soldier outposts that could not be supported, and Taliban isolated those posts and were able to pressure the soldiers to surrender, and that kind of caused a momentum that other soldiers were looking at their fellow soldiers surrendering en masse, and got demoralized, and often they were feeling that they should not be actually fighting that hard and just may surrender because they were afraid that if they fight hard, they would also not be supported and they would be isolated, and the Taliban always also proved very brutal when they actually ran over a post. So just that aspect of it, that the fact that Afghan soldiers were not willing to fight for the government, is just inaccurate. Just you can look at the UNAMA data and see how many soldiers were dying every day until the very end. And compared to the American troops, which towards the end, U.S., that's a good thing. U.S. had no casualty in Afghanistan, almost no casualty in Afghanistan. The other issue from his speech was that he was not willing to accept any responsibility. It was as if the U.S. was there, just bystander. The soldiers were there, and for some reason, the Afghans were in charge of everything, and they failed, and now U.S. had to leave. It's just a very disingenuous statement. The U.S. and Afghans, and the Afghan leaders he mentioned, and who are to blame, they absolutely must be blamed for what happened. They both contributed to what happened in Afghanistan. Many aspects of governance, important policy decisions, conduct of war, all sort of governance issues were either Americans advised on, there were American staff involved, there was an army of consultants and NGOs, development service providers, and such that were involved in all aspects of governance, from health to education to finance, any aspects that you can imagine. Similarly with the military, work closely together. I do admit, and I absolutely believe, that the responsibility to protect Afghanistan ultimately was on the Afghan government and Afghans. But whatever the outcome was in terms of failed leadership and corrupt governments, which were all true, the U.S. had a role to play. It doesn't mean that the U.S. should have stayed in Afghanistan longer. That's not what I mean. But I'm just saying that the way that President Biden was distancing U.S. from everything that happened over the past 2 years is just disingenuous and just inaccurate. And finally, with regard to the withdrawal, as I said, I'm not going to comment on whether it was the right or wrong thing, but I do believe it was not handled well. It was handled in a way that created a logistical gap in Afghan security forces. It was handled in a way that demoralized Afghan forces and created a kind of negative psychological environment for them. It was handled in a way, U.S. in rush to actually get out its troops, forced the Afghan government to make many concessions to the Taliban without getting much in return. For example, 5,000 Taliban troops were released under immense pressure from the United States. So, I mean, we can talk about how it was handled. And towards the end, the way the evacuation was handled and such, it was just horrible. Now, to your question of who the Taliban are, and it is a complex movement. It has its history. It has been morphing into different things at different times. What you can say is that it has been an effective insurgency, and they were able to cause the Afghan government to collapse. That's certain. That it is something we've witnessed. It's really not debatable. In terms of why and how they did it and what they want to do, that's a murky picture. They had a narrative they presented to their fighters to recruit and motivate them to fight. It involved establishment of the Sharia, their understanding of Islamic law, which is not shared by most Afghans. Is shared by some Afghans, but not most. They also talked about getting the foreigners, of whom they considered occupiers and invaders, out of the country. Those were kind of the motives that they presented for the soldiers. But also on the ground, it was a very complex picture. People joined the Taliban for different reasons, sometimes often for local dynamics, for protection, for also just taking advantage of the opportunity that would be given to someone who was part of the Taliban in terms of power and other aspects that come from being a militia that has support on the ground. There's a complex picture. There are obviously ideologically motivated actors underground as well. In terms of what they're going to be when they actually come into power, we have one reference point. When they were in power, that's in 1990s, they ruled brutally, and there are obviously, more world is familiar with it, and Afghans have experienced it firsthand, how they rule. That's one reference point. The question is, have they changed? Will they govern differently? You pointed out that there have been different messaging. They have announced national amnesty. They have said that they, in principle, believe that women can continue education and work under certain conditions that are not clarified yet. They have done some positive gestures so far. For example, as you pointed out, a Taliban representative talked to a woman presenter. That's a welcome development. They also allowed the Shias of Afghanistan, which are a minority, and they don't follow the dominant sect of Islam that is in Afghanistan. It's a Hanafi. They are a minority, a sizable minority in Afghanistan. Shias. They allowed them to continue the rituals of Ashura, which is an important ritual for the Shias. Involves a lot of public acts of self-plugging and other aspects. It happens every year in Afghanistan. That the Taliban allowed it. There were pictures coming up that they went actually to some of those events and they showed solidarity. That's a very positive thing. They also met with the Hindus and Sikhs representative of Afghanistan, some Taliban said, and they give them assurance that they will be protected, they will be safe in Kabul. Both of these happen in Kabul and in Herat, where I also have family members in Herat, and I will talk to them. And I also have seen reports of that happening in Herat. I cannot talk to the entire country. So those are good, positive messaging. But also, on the other hand, we have reports of people being taken for questioning, people being killed because of their government connections, and reports of summary executions of the forces that were surrendered until very recently. And it's just a very mixed picture, very unclear picture at this point. And the uncertainty is fueling the refugee exodus. People are afraid of the future. They are afraid of what may come, and they're trying to get out as they can, when they can. And you have to remember, Taliban control almost entire land crossing, and there's no flight flying out of any parts of the country except for Kabul airport, which is not under Taliban control. It is under U.S. control. So people trying to get out, they see this as a window that if it closes, U.S. leaves, then the Taliban will take over airport, and then anyone would like to leave the country, they would have to go to the U.S. to the Taliban authority. So if you are afraid of a retaliation, revenge taken by the Taliban, you will certainly try to get out as soon as possible through the Kabul airport, the only kind of departure point left, without having to go through the Taliban kind of possible screening of who can leave the country. Taliban have said they will let anyone who wants to leave, but you have to realize that these messages are not very credible for very good reasons. They are not credible because until very recently, in matters of like days ago, Taliban considered any civilian judiciary employee of the government a legitimate target. And they had a complex attack not long ago, like a couple of weeks ago in Kabul, that targeted the Minister of Defense's home, guest house, which were where MPs, Afghanistan members of parliament, were located, and killed many civilians. It was a complex attack, a car bomb. These buildings were destroyed to a large radius of the place. And they also had an ongoing assassination kind of campaign of judiciary prosecutors, of female police officers. So it was for them to claim that they have transformed in their character in this short period of time doesn't seem believable to most Afghans, and that's why you're seeing the rush to the door. And you have to realize that many people believe that it's a war tactic. As soon as Taliban consolidates power, as soon as the U.S. U.S. leaves Afghanistan, international community will not be engaged as it is right now. Then there will be basically purging happening. That's why people are so afraid. Whether that's going to actually come true, or the Taliban will just come true with the messages of hopes they are giving people, just remains to be seen. But the picture is murky, and it is a mixed picture. Another complication we have here is that there is not a lot of journalism outside of Kabul happening. I mean, there has been a chilling effect on journalists not daring to go out and document what was happening. Because you have to realize there is Taliban have this brutal image in Afghanistan for good reasons. They have fought a brutal insurgency. They killed aid workers. They beheaded their opponents. They executed many people upon surrender. They mined many people. It was a brutal insurgency. Not to say that the government did not cause destruction. The government, through its air bombardments, destroyed many parts of the countryside. And they caused many civilian casualties. And for many of those people, the moments of rest that they're experiencing, because there's really no war going on, Taliban just took over the country, the moments of rest they're feeling is very much welcome. And they have a different feeling towards the Taliban victory. If for nothing else, just the end of war is celebrated to large parts of the country. And some of them actually hold the government accountable for the horror they were living. So I'm not trying to say just the Taliban were the cause of all the destruction that was going on in the country. It was a war, but Taliban were using brutal methods. So now, whether it is continuing to happen in areas we don't have eyes on, because the journalists are too afraid to speak out, to document and reflect, kind of leaves us relying on a hearsay. People saying, "I heard this person say this thing happened there." Unless we have enough journalists on the ground and journalists who can actually work independently, we will not really know the full picture yet. The other side of it is that the Taliban will have to actually make pronouncement on matters of policy and then follow through. So far, they've remained vague as well.
Professor Rahimi, we have to wrap, and we have 10 seconds, but are you afraid to go back right now? You were en route when the Taliban took Kabul.
At the moment, yes. I'm still hesitant. I'm afraid of the future for my country and for everyone who's there. I will go back if the promise of amnesty hold up. I do want to continue to educate the new generation of Afghanistan. They have taken over our university, American University of Afghanistan. The campus was taken over by the Taliban. We had evacuated already, but they entered the campus. They control the campus. Whether we will be able to resume and under what conditions, what will be the rules for our operation, it's not known. We will continue to teach remotely to our students. But I would, if the promise of amnesty hold up, there is this environment where I feel like I can.
The Skype froze, but I want to thank Haroon Rahimi, Assistant Professor of Law at the American University of Afghanistan. He was speaking to us from Istanbul, Turkey. Coming up, we go to investigative journalist Asmat Khan and retired U.S. Army Colonel Ann Wright, who helped reopen the U.S. Embassy in Kabul nearly 2 decades ago. Stay with us. Her describing music by Ustad Muhammad Omar. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. To talk more about the crisis in Afghanistan, we're joined by 2 guests. The award-winning investigative reporter Asmat Khan, who has reported extensively from Afghanistan, New York Times Magazine contributing writer and Carnegie Fellow. She's also a visiting professor at Columbia University. And we're joined by Ann Wright, retired U.S. Army colonel and former U.S. State Department official. She was part of the team that reopened the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan in December 2001. In 2003, she resigned on the eve of the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq. She's now a member of Code Pink and Veterans for Peace. Ann Wright, let's begin with you. Take us back 20 years. You reopened the U.S. Embassy right after the U.S. invaded and attacked Afghanistan. Can you talk about that moment and then how you came to change your views? You were a U.S. Army colonel and condemn the wars.
Thank you, Amy. Yes, I went to Afghanistan shortly after the U.S. Went into Afghanistan, first with the CIA and then with a small team of Special Forces folks. We reopened the embassy in December of 2001. I anticipated that it was going to be a short time the United States was going to be in Afghanistan to go after al-Qaeda and then get out. However, as we know, that did not happen. And as I stayed there over 5 months and saw that the U.S. government was really not providing any sort of funding for any programs that we thought perhaps we should do very quickly, like in education and health, and then went on to my next assignment, which was in Mongolia, I found that the U.S. government had already made its decision that it was going to invade and occupy Iraq, a country that had nothing to do with 9/11. And that's where I decided that I would resign from the U.S. government in opposition to that war.
Can you talk about watching the U.S. Embassy close now and what you think should happen? Also, your response to what President Biden said yesterday.
Well, first, I don't think the embassy should have closed. I mean, it's one thing that the Taliban came in, but, you know, not all embassies closed in Kabul. If the United States really wants to help the people of Afghanistan over the continuing period next, you know, the next years, we've got to have a presence in Afghanistan. I have closed embassies before. I closed the U.S. Embassy in Sierra Leone in 1997 due to the violence there. And so I do recognize that the U.S. government did not know for sure what the Taliban was going to do when it came into Kabul. However, we have had negotiators in Doha for the last 18 months, including Zalmay Khalilzad, who's Afghan himself, Afghan-American, but he's been the U.S. Special Envoy to Afghanistan, the U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan, as well as the Ambassador to Iraq and the Ambassador to the United Nations, and has been the special negotiator with the Taliban for 18 months. So I would have anticipated that there would have been some sort of an agreement that not only would the Taliban not shoot at U.S. military, but that it would not harm the U.S. embassy, and that it would be possible for the embassy to remain open. Closing it sends a real signal, and when that signal was made to the government, leading Ghani, I think, to say, well, if the U.S. is going to pull its embassy out, and then that he was going to get out, and for the military and police forces around the country to seeing that the U.S. At long last, I was one of the people, many of the people that said that the U.S. needed to get out of Afghanistan. We did not need to be in there for 20 years, but the way that it was done certainly did not in any way assist in the security of the country.
Let's bring in Asmat Khan, the investigative reporter who's covered Afghanistan for years. Your response to President Biden to the complete chaos at the airport, the thousands of Afghans who are trying to leave, and the Taliban victory in Afghanistan overall.
So President Biden really focused on the decision to end the war and not on that searing criticism of this withdrawal, the chaos we're seeing at the airport, the leaving behind of many people to whom the United States had made promises, people like translators, people like local journalists who were working with American journalists, as well as activists who now face not just great uncertainty, like was earlier being talked about, but significant threats to their lives and safety. So none of that was really discussed in any detail. But I think another omission that really needs to be highlighted is the fact that President Biden took this negative view of Afghan security forces for, quote, not fighting. And that's not accurate. You know, as the earlier speaker was describing, many Afghan soldiers have died fighting the Taliban over the last 20 years, countless, whereas American soldiers, since Operation Freedom Sentinel began in 2015, you know, we've lost 64 American soldiers in hostile deaths in Afghanistan. So there is a real disparity about who was paying the human costs of that fight, at least from the side that's fighting the Taliban. But at the same time, what he didn't acknowledge was the fact that the entire way that those soldiers were doing that fight was with the support of U.S. air power. So the United States was bombing heavily parts of that country where there were fights against the Taliban raging. So just to give some context, in 2019, the United States dropped more bombs in Afghanistan than in any previous year of the war. So I think it was something close to more than 6,200 bombs that year as they were trying to negotiate. So even with incredible bombs dropping, you know, this was the deal they were able to get. And even then, look at how many Afghan soldiers were dying. Now, once you take that level of air power out of the mix, who would expect any Afghan soldiers to continue to fight? If that many Afghan soldiers died with the support of air power, what happens when you take that out of the mix? Now, on top of that, I just need to say that that air power may have helped keep this tenuous hold that the Afghan government had on the country, but it also killed scores of civilians in rural areas that don't often get talked about. Nearly 3/4 of Afghanistan is rural countryside. The majority of the population comes from these kinds of areas, populations that have seen the brunt of the war, and we rarely hear about. And they've suffered not just bombings, airstrikes, and night raids, but also Taliban attacks. And many of them wanted this war to end. And you can't really talk about that air power and the tenuous grip that the government had without also acknowledging the ways in which that has created space for the Taliban, where even civilians who didn't like the Taliban just wanted the war to end. So it kind of makes sense. Once you take air power out of the mix, that sort of tenuous hold falls. But at the same time, at this point, the Taliban has resuscitated itself and grown. You know, many of its more recent recruits were people who did lose loved ones and really wanted revenge for those casualties. So in many ways, as surprising the swiftness of it was, it also makes sense what we see happening right now.
The Intercept reports that military stocks outperformed the stock market overall by 58% during the Afghanistan war, including Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics. Quote, from the perspective of some of the most powerful people in the U.S., the Afghanistan war may have been an extraordinary success. Notably, the boards of directors of all 5 military contractors include retired top-level military officers. You have written extensively, Asmat, about these contracts and who financially profited from this war.
It's really stunning. It's incredibly stunning because people don't often talk about the massive wealth. The people who maybe went to Afghanistan temporarily, got hazard pay and built themselves homes, wealthy businessmen, former military officials who now, by the way, come on television talk shows to give their views without concealing necessarily the fact that they're on boards of many of these defense contractors. So there has been incredible corruption on the part of many Americans, on the part of many contractors, as well as just on the ground, that has really helped to isolate local people from the Afghan government. And so just to give you some examples, I spent a lot of time investigating U.S.-funded schools in Afghanistan, something that we might consider the kind of untouchable success of the war, right? That in these 20 years, the United States has radically transformed education for Afghan children and in particular girls. And I really dug into the schools the United States had funded and picked 50 of them in 7 battlefield provinces and went to go see, what's happening at these schools now. And when I would dig into it, I think 10% of the schools either were never built or no longer exist. A vast majority of them were falling apart. And then when I would try to understand what happened, for example, in one case, there was a school that was missing. Turns out it was built in the village of a notorious Afghan police chief who was allied with the United States, Abdul Razak, known for many human rights abuses. And the local education chief said, yes, we built it here, and there were no children in this village for 3 years, so nobody really attended. The school never opened for a number of years. In another instance, the school I arrived at was empty, incomplete, never finished, and all the kids were across the street at a mosque having a religious education, not the curriculum that they were on the books as recording having had. And when I tried to figure out what happened, it turned out the contract for the school went to the brother of the district governor, who then, pilfered the money, and it was never finished as a result of that. Down the block in another part of Kandahar, the contract for a school was given to a notorious local warlord who's actually for the clinic that was going to be built next to the school, was given to this notorious warlord who basically wound up being the source for the rise of the Taliban in many ways. His family was part of that sort of corruption in the early years that preceded the Taliban that really riled up individuals to support the Taliban because of the massive corruption and the human rights abuses that were happening to Afghan people. So even something as noble and as worthy of effort as education has been mired in this kind of corruption, this kind of wheeling and dealing. And if we had to understand why, I think it's the fact that counterterrorism goals were baked into every single aspect of the American project in Afghanistan. So even something great like schools, had these metrics, had this desire to imbue a counterterrorism narrative of some kind that left them willing to work with people who were abusive actors in the name of fighting terrorism, when in reality they often undercut Afghan people and a lot of the promises of the United States at almost every level.
Asma Khan, I want to thank you for being with us and give Lieutenant Colonel Ann Wright the final word as you speak to us now from Honolulu, from Hawaii, and you look at what's happening in Afghanistan where you were almost 2 decades ago, what you think needs to happen and what you think Americans should understand about the U.S. war in Afghanistan.
Well, I think that the U.S. public ought to be very wary of every administration that thinks that we should take a military option in trying to resolve any sort of conflict. We have seen that the United States in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, the lies that are told to us about why we need to go into countries with our military versus having some non-military resolution to these issues is really, really important. And particularly as we face our government right now that's saying that China and Russia are our enemies, that are threats to our national security, we the U.S. people have to push back against our government, against any more military invasions, occupations, attacks on any country. And my heart goes out. It bleeds for the people of Afghanistan who have suffered through these decades long of war, of violence. And I certainly hope that the next years somehow calm down and that the Taliban takes a very different tack than what it had when it was in power from 1996 to 2001, because the people of Afghanistan deserve much better than what they have had. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us. And, of course, we'll continue to cover this. I demoted you, Ann. Ann Wright is a retired U.S. Army colonel and former U.S. State Department official who was part of the team that reopened the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan in December 2001. And Asma Khan, investigative reporter, contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine. We'll link to your articles, including the one you described, Ghost Students, Ghost Teachers, Ghost Schools. When we come back, we go to Haiti, where the tropical storm has slammed the same parts of the country shattered by the earthquake on Saturday that's killed more than 1,400 people. Stay with us. Haiti by Alberto Macerca and Franz Cassius. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman as we turn to Haiti, where heavy rainfall from Tropical Storm Grace drenched the same parts of the country Monday hit by Saturday's earthquake, where the death toll has now climbed to more than 1,400 and 7,000 suffering injuries amidst overwhelmed hospitals. Thousands more have been left homeless. Doctors treated hundreds of injured people in makeshift tents, including young children and the elderly. Meanwhile, the investigative judge charged with overseeing the multinational probe into last month's assassination of Haitian President Jovenel Moïse stepped down on Friday, saying he's concerned for his safety after one of his court clerks was found dead. These are some of the survivors.
My wife called me to have a coffee with her when the quake hit. We were talking and I heard a sound. We tried to get out quickly, but the stairs were destroyed. But thanks to God, we were able to get out. Against the force of nature, nobody could save us but God.
My house is completely destroyed. I have lost everything. I don't even have bed sheets. I have no food. I have nothing.
We were in our home when the quake happened. A number of people who were inside could not escape. The elderly were under the rubble. My father's 2 legs broke, and my mother-in-law has broken a leg. On the day of the quake, we went to the hospital with them, but there weren't enough medics to treat them. They are suffering. I don't know what to do.
We're joined right now by Jacqueline Charles. She is the Haiti and Caribbean correspondent at the Miami Herald. She's reported on Haiti and the English-speaking Caribbean for the Miami Herald for over a decade. She's a Pulitzer Prize finalist for her coverage of the 2010 Haiti earthquake, awarded the 2018 Maria Moore's Cabot Prize, the most prestigious award for coverage of the Americas. She's right now in Les Cayes, Haiti, not far from the earthquake's epicenter. Can you describe, Jacqueline, what you have seen as you've traveled through the earthquake-hit area?
Well, when you travel through this area, I mean, what you see are homes that, may look like they're okay, and then when you take a second look, you will see that the bottom of the house is completely collapsed, or you see where the whole house has collapsed. This is an area that is agricultural. There are a lot of plains. So the houses are not, right up under each other like we had in Port-au-Prince. It's not teeming. So visually, the devastation, of course, is different from what we saw in that 2010 earthquake. But the impact is just as great because these are individuals who were still in the process of rebuilding from Hurricane Matthew just 5 years ago. And now they've basically lost their homes. People are afraid to sleep in buildings, so they've been sleeping in their yards. And, of course, last night we had Grace that came in here, and now people are sort of losing patience because they don't have tents. They were just using, sheets or whatever they could. Some, not even that. They were just exposed to the elements, and they had to choose between the aftershocks or the rain.
What was your response when you first heard 7.2 category on the Richter scale, this earthquake?
Oh, my God. So, I had just been in Haiti for an entire month following the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse, and I literally had just gotten off of a plane that morning, and when I heard that, it was like, oh, my God, here we go. And, of course, having covered the earthquake, I just did a project last year, 10 years after. We knew that there was going to be a big one, another big one. But we always assumed that it would be in the north of the country. And the fact that this happened in the south, it took a lot of people by surprise. So the first thing you're thinking about is where, and in terms of the death toll and the damage, what are we going to find, given that we know that 7.0 just 11 years ago almost wiped out Port-au-Prince.
So among the dead are the mayor, the former mayor of Les Cayes, Gabriel Fortuné?
Yes, Gabriel Fortuné, the former mayor of Les Cayes. He was also an advisor to the assassinated President Jovenel Moïse. He's also a former senator, a very huge figure here. He was in his hotel. We understand that there was a meeting going on, and yes, he died in the rubble. He was among 4 individuals who were taken to a local hospital here just to confirm, that they had died. And that was probably the biggest news in terms of the death. Well, we have priests who have died. We've got, community leaders. I mean, the same thing that we saw in 2010. Everybody has a story about someone. Yesterday, I visited the business owner of a supermarket and a hotel, and 2 of his employees died. I spoke to a security guard, and she's still crushed. You can still smell the stench of death there, even though they had retrieved the body. But understand that one of them, it was body parts, and it was, one of the other person who died was her fellow security guard, who she had just relieved at 6 o'clock, and this quake happened at 8:30 a.m.
So, if you can talk about the hospitals and the needs right now.
One of the things that we saw before, and we're seeing it today, is Haitians are not sitting around and waiting for international aid. They're not waiting for the international community to come and rescue them. They are doing it on their own, but they're doing it in a situation where they lack even bandages, medical tape, anesthesia, IV. Every day people are coming with injuries. Some have tried to just wait it out because they don't have the means for transportation, or they think they have to pay. And so the hospitals have been overwhelmed, but they seriously lack medical supplies because of the situation at the southern entrance of Port-au-Prince with the gangs. People in Port-au-Prince who would like to come and provide assistance, they can't do it for fear of that road. It's not easy getting into this region because of the humanitarian flights, and there are also a limited number of flights. But there is a huge need in the hospitals here. And again, some of these hospitals have been damaged. So they are basically turning their courtyards, into makeshift hospital wards. One hospital, the doctor's residence is now an operating room. They themselves have done over 100 operations, but because there's so many fractures, bone fractures, they lack even the iron that they're needed to repair a lot of these injuries.
And before we go, this happening in the midst of a political earthquake. You have the assassination of the Haitian president, Moïse, and you have the judge presiding over the investigation quitting because one of the court clerks was just found murdered.
His court clerk was found murdered just days earlier. And yes, he withdrew from this investigation a day before this earthquake. He's concerned about his safety. We still have the unresolved issue in terms of the president's brazen assassination in the middle of the night. His wife was seriously wounded. 44 people have been arrested, but police still have not identified the mastermind of this crime or the motive. And so that is still very much a huge issue. And we have to remember the president was one of 11 elected officials in a country of 11.5 million. So there's been this pressure from the United States and others for Haiti to hold elections. At the Miami Herald, we spoke with Prime Minister Ariel Henry, and he basically said, as of right now, there is no electoral calendar. On top of the fact that he needs to get some sort of a political accord, get everybody on board and say this is the way we need to go. And he is determined to have elections. You cannot be a democracy without elections, is what he said. But you now have this disaster, which he has declared a month, state of emergency to try to address it. And we still don't know yet in terms of what damage was done as a result of Grace, because of the rains. This is an area that's very prone to mudslides. I have to tell you, yesterday there were huge boulders in the roads. There's the road to Jérémie, which is the other area which was also affected. That road has been cut off because the boulders in the road has been split and cut. So we're going to basically go out now. We understand that they've sort of halted some of those assessments because of the weather continues to deteriorate. And so we may be looking, at more needs in just a few hours.
Well, Jackie Sherrill, please stay safe. Jacqueline Sherrill is the Haiti and Caribbean correspondent at the Miami Herald, and we're going to link to all of your reporting at democracynow.org. She's talking to us from Lake Kai, near the epicenter of the earthquake. Democracy Now! Produced with Renee Felsz, Mike Park, Gina Guzder, Messiah Rhodes, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Terracena, Tammy Warren, Tarina Ndura, Sam Makov, Tamara Studio. Special thanks to Julie Crosby. I'm Amy Goodman.